Great. It looks like it's 9 p.m. KL time right now, 9 a.m. Eastern. So we'll kick it off. Salam and greetings from Malaysia, and welcome to our CSW65 parallel event webinar today, titled Reconciling Religion and Rights, Equality and Justice in Muslim Family Laws. I'm Alex McCarthy, the International Advocacy Officer at Musawah, the global movement for equality and justice in Muslim family. Before we kick off, let me run through a few housekeeping items. The webinar is scheduled for 2 hours, so we'll kick off with a short introduction to the webinar and to the speakers, and then we'll go into 75 minutes of interventions from the 5 speakers, followed by about 20 minutes of audience Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. So audience members, please type your questions in the chat box, and if relevant, address them to the specific speaker, and we'll try to get to them during the Q&A session. This webinar is also being live streamed via Musawah's Facebook page. So if you feel like sharing with your friends later, that will be available at www.facebook.com/musawahmovement/live. And feel free to tag us on social media. My colleague is sharing the links in the chat right now for all the various accounts that are associated with our partners who are showing up on the webinar with us today. So let's get on with the show. Now, many of you may be familiar with Musawah, but for those of you who are not, Musawah was formed a decade ago in 2009 by a group of Muslim women, activists and scholars who were publicly seeking to reclaim Islam's spirit of justice for everyone. We call ourselves a knowledge building movement because the basis of our advocacy and activism is a strong foundation of knowledge. We believe that Musawah's inclusive and holistic approach to engaging with religion is the key to advancing gender equality in a way that's not only responsive to the needs of the 21st century, but also critical and groundbreaking. The feminist knowledge in Islam that we developed is grounded in principles and jurisprudence from the Islamic tradition, international human rights standards, constitutional guarantees of equality and non-discrimination, and the lived realities of women's and men's lives today. Musawah's focus is to engage with religion from a rights perspective, to bridge that gap between religion and rights, and to break the hegemonic belief that Islam and women's rights are opposed to each other. And that's precisely kind of the objective that we have here for this webinar today, and why we have this ensemble of great speakers arranged for you to really dive into this topic and share with you the knowledge and the strategies that they've developed working in their specific contexts. And here to take you through this reconciliation of religion and rights, I am truly honored to introduce you to our exciting lineup of speakers today. If we can take down the slide real quick while I do the introductions. Okay, great, thank you. Hala Al-Karib is the Regional Director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, or SIHA Network. She's an activist and social and gender research practitioner from Sudan, and is also the editorial head of the annual journal Women in Islam. And her activism has specifically focused on women's and girls' rights, refugees, displaced persons, and the challenges faced by minority communities. She is widely published. I'll let you look at the different print and online medias that she has published in prior to this, and certainly go check out the work of SIHA Network after this webinar. And then I'll move on to my colleague Hishama Hameen, who is the coordinator of Musawah's Global Campaign for Justice in Muslim Family Laws. She's also an activist who works on the ground in Sri Lanka to push for reform of Muslim family laws, where she co-founded the Muslim Personal Law Reform Action Group, or MPL-RAG. Hishama has previously conducted extensive research and in fact within Musawah coordinated our activities with our CEDAW engagement, and she has really kind of taken that work to the next level. So she'll be sharing some exciting things in the following interventions. And then next up, we'll move on to Nada Nashat, who is currently the advocacy coordinator at the Center for Egyptian Women's Legal Assistance, or CEULA, based in Cairo, Egypt. And Nada has a long history of being involved with Musawah as the member of the International Advisory Group in 2016 and 2017. And she's participated in various international events, including past CSWs, UPRs, the Beijing Platform for Action meetings, etc. And she's also coordinated a lot of the national advocacy efforts in Egypt to amend the personal status law in order to promote access to justice and eradicate inequalities between genders, as well as a project to engage women leaders in combating corruption. And so we're very excited to hear about Nada's work in Egypt here today as well. And next up, we have Nurjihan Safia Niaz, who is a co-founder member of Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan, or BMMA in India. And she's been working on Muslim women's issues in India for the past 28 years through activism, knowledge building, capacity building, training, and enabling women's leadership. She's played a key role in securing legislation against triple divorce, which has impacted the lives of 80 million Muslim women in India, as well as working to enable women to become formally trained qazis in the court system there, which has typically been a male-dominated bastion. And so really the work that she's bringing today is crucial for not just the Indian context, but also it serves as an example for other Muslim women's rights organizers and community builders as well. And so we're very lucky to have Nurjihan with us today. And then last but not least, we have Sharina Mohammed Sharif, who is the Program Manager for Advocacy, Legal Services, and Research in Sisters in Islam, which is a Malaysian NGO that works to advance the rights of Muslim women within the framework of Islam, human rights, constitutional guarantees, and as always, grounded by the lived realities of the people who are affected. Her work has focused on injustices experienced by women as a result of these biased laws, policies, and institutional structures. And really, the work of Sisters in Islam is also, again, an example for a lot of the work that is being done in other countries, and truly an inspiration for a lot of us. Sherry's team operates Telenisa, which is a free helpline for Muslims requiring legal advice under Islamic family laws. And that also has been very crucial. And we'll hear a little bit more about some of the work that Sherry and her team have been doing in Malaysia as well. So these are your speakers before you. And I don't want to take up too much more time because I think they have each a lot of really exciting information to share with us today. And so to kick us off, I would like to invite my colleague Hishama to give us a global overview of the landscape of Muslim family laws. What do they look like?
Thank you, Alex, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today for this very important conversation. One of Musawah's key research initiatives in the past decade has been to assess how and why Muslim women's lives and rights are affected by discriminatory family laws and practices, and what some of those lived realities are for women living in Muslim contexts. If I may ask my colleague to please put my slide up. I just want to show you an example. Groundbreaking scholarship of Muslim scholars who have deep dived into understanding and recognizing the historical roots of inequalities in Muslim family laws, or as we like to call it at Musawah, the DNA of patriarchy in Muslim contexts. These indicate that the origins of the inequalities lie primarily in male scholars interpreting familial and gender roles, using concepts such as male authority and male guardianship, or kiwama and wilaya, as the foundation and the basis for their interpretations. It is these concepts that have actually fed into the legal frameworks that condone and in many instances actively promote domination by husbands and submission by the wife. Men are deemed to be protectors of women and the sole providers for their households, while women and girls in turn are required to be obedient towards their husbands and their male guardians. So in researching Muslim family laws, procedures, and practices across 33 countries at Musawah, 33 and counting, by the way, we are expanding to, inshallah, 45, Muslim countries that have, Muslim contexts that have discriminatory family laws and practices. But from what we know of the 35 countries, we know that these concepts have seeped their way into provisions in codified legislation, and to this day impact women in all phases of marriage and family life. And this includes when entering into marriage, during marriage, and at the time of dissolution of marriage. Next slide, please. So the slide you see before you is essentially 12 main issues that cut across most of these family laws in the global context, regardless of whether they're from Muslim majority countries or Muslim minority contexts. And these include issues that come up before marriage, for example, consenting to marriage and capacity of women to enter into marriage. In many Muslim family laws, women do not have the autonomous free will to enter into marriage as men do, and they require the permission from a male guardian or a male judge to marry. This can lead and has many instances led to forced marriage, which is condoned by the law in many of these countries. It is, however, interesting to note that this practice in fact differs based on scholarly interpretation that the law is based on. So we can see that these are very much based on these interpretations. Many Muslim family laws also allow child marriage, or they have lower age of marriage for girls than for boys. However, we're also seeing that one of the key areas of reform in Muslim family laws in the past few years, in fact, have been in raising age of marriage. So we do see some changes happening as well. In terms of issues that arise during marriage, just to give you a very quick overview, we see that the majority of Muslim family laws allow polygamy. And these are with varying conditions, about how men can enter into polygamous marriages. Some Muslim family laws do not require women or their existing or future wives to consent, for example, while others do. Violence against women in the family in Muslim contexts also continue to be steeped in very patriarchal notions of authority and power. At the time of dissolution of marriage, we see that many countries with Muslim family laws have unequal provisions and procedures for divorce of women and men. Muslim men are entitled to unilateral talaq divorce, often without a just cause. They just have the right because they're men. While women have to show evidence in order to divorce, even if they have just reason like domestic violence, the process is much more harder. Again, we see very few countries like Tunisia and Turkey, which have equalized divorce processes for both parties, but the majority of the legislation continues to be discriminatory. Financial rights at the time of divorce, and specifically a right to matrimonial property, continues to be a non-existing concept in a majority of Muslim family laws. Interestingly, however, some of the most progressive legislation is coming from Southeast Asia. And with countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, and Singapore showing some really advanced legislation on matrimonial property. Unfortunately, unequal right to divorce continues to be a major challenge for women, Muslim women across the world, as my colleagues might also refer later. Child custody and guardianship is another huge issue for women. The legal norm continues to be that fathers are considered the primary guardians of children. And while women may be able to get custody, they're not automatically granted the right to as legal guardians in many of these contexts, primarily because of the concept of male guardianship and male authority. Next slide, please. Thank you. If we were to look at the various gender equality surveys, that span globally, for example, Women's Economic Forum, Gender Survey Gap, and Gender Gap Survey, and World Bank's Women Law and Business Survey, we can see that Muslim countries, including high and middle income countries, are at the very bottom of the global lists on gender equality. In fact, 20 to 21 countries at the bottom 25 of these surveys are often Muslim majority contexts. So what does this mean? This means that it's not only notable, this means that it's notable that not only does unjust and discriminatory family laws impact women in all areas of their life, autonomy and decision-making, mobility and access to resources, education and livelihood opportunities and political participation, for example, but it also has long-standing impacts on the social, economic, and human development of a country. So just to conclude my first portion, to say that the cross-country global research, which uses this data, shows that without equality in the private sphere of the family, there can be no equality in the public sphere. And it identified family law reform as one of the most critical areas of legal framework that needs to change to accelerate gender equality for women. But it is also the most resistant and stubborn to reform. And this is because of so much myths and misconceptions around the interplay of religion and family laws, with regard to them.
That's really important, I think, Hishama, that you're bringing up these global data that are showing that this is a trend that's happening not just in particular countries, but also that it's happening all over the world, and that we can come to this as a shared struggle. And hopefully also that means that there's also shared strategies as well that can work. And so given what Hisham has just said about this kind of global overview of the landscape of Muslim family laws and what that looks like at a 40,000 foot level, then I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into the national contexts that we're dealing with. And if Sharina, if I can start with you, Sisters in Islam was established in Malaysia 30 years ago at a time when many women's rights movements around the world actually shied away from engaging with religion. And since then, CIS has really become a role model for success, the mothership for other organizations who recognize the importance of working at this intersection of religion and rights. Why did CIS decide it was important to engage with religion, Islam specifically in the Malaysian context, from a rights perspective? What did the context look like then when CIS was first starting versus what you're seeing now, and how you and your team are dealing with that? Sherry, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Alex and Musawah, also for having this session on a very important topic. I'm very excited to be speaking on the issue of Muslim family law reform, and also thank you for the really generous introduction on Sisters in Islam. But well, to answer your question, yes, many feminist movements at that time viewed religion as inherently patriarchal, and so, many did not include issues of religion within the feminist movements. But for us, and the women who were our stakeholders, we lived within the Islamic framework. Islam affected every part of our lives. We started with 8 women who were engaging with other women, and they talked about their difficulties in, getting a divorce, polygamy and its inherent injustices, violence in the home, and so on. And the source of all these were Islamic Sharia laws and the culture and the practices that were embedded within the Muslim communities here in Malaysia. So really, in order to deal with the real issues and the lived realities on the ground, we had to delve deeply into Islam as it is practiced in Malaysia. And we had to look at the laws and the institutions which are integral parts of in defining the type of Islam in Malaysia. And this includes the Sharia courts and the state authorities that conduct the policing of those laws. We even dealt with the politicization of Islam, the irregularities of Islamic laws vis-a-vis our federal constitution, and even how the local media reports and portrays Islam. But we dealt with it having human rights principles and the lived realities of women as part and parcel of the framework. So a broader look at how we believe the trajectory for religion, the way it should be practiced and enforced within our country and within our community. So really we were trying to bring about change according to the values and contextualize it within our modern society. So, back to the beginning, the founders' focus was to get their voices out into the mainstream, to create acceptance, because at that time, of course, there were not very many women who stepped up to make a challenge on women's position within society, within family, within religion, and so on. So it was necessary to stamp their validity and garner support, public support. And the issue was to get women's issues onto the national discourse, not in the corridors, not around the dinner table, but as a national level discourse. So, but many women obviously did not have the language for it. So, in the beginning, there was a lot of education going on, workshops, trainings, books being published, research papers, and so on. The engagements we had and we continue to have are generally, targeted to help women understand their rights under Islamic laws. And sometimes when other laws impact them as well, so we bring those up, situations like domestic violence, where it's not Islamic law, but obviously we need to talk about that as a matter of awareness. With government, we engage them a lot, mainly to change policy and for law reform. And I think the level of awareness has somewhat been increased. Obviously, there would be the very rural, perhaps the message perhaps has not come across as powerfully. But the area of policy and law reform continues to be really problematic. And the last reform we had was actually regressive to equality and justice of women, and it occurred in 2005. And since then, we haven't had a major reform to Islamic family laws. We see some positive signs in certain judgments meted out by Sharia courts. We have night courts that cater to, the difficulties of women leaving work and coming to court and so on. We have more Sharia judges, Sharia lawyers speaking out against domestic violence and other injustices. So this has been ongoing. We hope that, it will reach to a critical mass where the mindset has changed so that we can then deal with policy and law reform more efficiently. The political process is very much interlinked to a very conservative reading of Islam. So over time, 30 years on, we've had to shift. We've taken political Islam because the whole idea of conservative Islam has a significant impact. And we believe that is one of the biggest biggest issues blocking the progress of Muslim family laws. They don't even want to put it on the table because the issues there they consider are, divine and cannot be changed. So that kind of thinking itself needs to be, tackled head on. We have started collaborating with conservative Muslim groups, to understand them, to agree where we can agree. There are many areas that we agree on, like child marriage and so on. And there are areas that we cannot agree on yet, although we are in, I think, conversation. I think that's positive. And other areas also we've included, like fair elections, anti-corruption, because the bigger picture of democracy is being undermined in Malaysia using, the rhetoric of religion. And now we're very much engaging with the youth because we believe they are being increasingly a powerful force for the advancement of human rights and democratic principles. So they've grown up with different values. They're not, pinned down by very conservative values. They have an open mind. They're willing to listen and learn. So basically, garnering all these different stakeholders, our strategy is to shift the understanding of Islam within the larger sphere. And we hope changing minds at the larger picture of what Islam is, what Islam should we have in Malaysia, that will then create space for change in our Islamic family laws in Malaysia. So Alex, I think I'll stop there for now. And maybe we can deal with questions and answers later.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Sherry. And I think this there are some really important ideas that you have touched on here that I just want to highlight a little bit before we move on. But that there's this idea of getting an alternative narrative of Islam into the public discourse to help women understand their rights within this context of understanding Islam as a trajectory of justice, that it's possible to achieve equality, that it's possible to achieve justice, and that the patriarchal conservative reading is not the only way, even though that's something that a lot of us have learned and internalized, and it takes a lot of work to unlearn and dismantle these different systems. And so again, kudos to you and your team and CIS for the work that you've done, really not just in changing this in Malaysia, but also in providing the example to other contexts that sorely need this example to be able to point to and to work towards in their own contexts. And especially this idea of divine Sharia law and how the rhetoric of religion, but a very particular kind of religion, has been weaponized in order to push forward a particular political agenda. And so thank you for those points. And I hope that maybe we can get to some more questions or maybe have you expand a little bit more on CIS's work after this. But with that, then I also want to shift to Nada. CIOLA did something similar to CIS. In Egypt, we see that religious authority is tightly bound with political power. Al-Azhar is recognized the world over as a religious authority, but it's also seen to have a close relationship with the state. And much of the MENA region, and indeed the Muslim world, looks to Egypt as an example for personal status laws and how they should be done. From Hishama's points raised earlier, we know from Mala Htun's research that in countries where religious power is so intertwined with political power, it becomes even more difficult to dismantle these family laws that discriminate against women and girls. How then do you work in that context? And to follow on that as well, given the centrality of Egypt and its decisions with regard to religious authority in public and private spaces, how does that affect the work that CIOLA is doing and the strategies that you adopt to push for reform?
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you everyone who's speaking. Just want to give you, these important questions are they are crucial to my introduction to the context and whatever is happening right now in the Egyptian context. So for example, yes, indeed, there is some sort of intertwining between the religious authorities in Egypt and the political authority. We have, but this is according to a long history of Al-Azhar having powers over certain laws, for example, or how they are affecting our culture, and also the church, because the Egyptian community, it consists of mainly Muslim and Christians, and of course we have other religious minorities, but this is another discussion. But mainly with Muslim and Christian Egyptians, you will find that there is a problem how the political state is dealing with them. So in the Egyptian constitution, we have Article 2, which says that Islam is the religion of the state. It's the official religion of the state. And no legislation whatsoever can contradict Article number 2. Article number 3 says that for non-Muslims, specifically Christians and Jews, they have the right to resort to their own religions in their family matters. And this is a constitutional article. While we have Article 53 says that all citizens are equal before the law. So we have equality recognized by the state according to the constitution, but also we have religion recognized as source of legislations. So the question is, do they contradict? Is religion and rights contradict? This is the main question. And the answer is no, not at all. It's the practice that contradicts. So just giving you a little bit of a context as well. So in spite of the fact that we have articles like number 2 or number 3, they're mainly used in personal status matters, so family matters, matters related to women. It's always the arguments of this is a religious matter, we should not, you have to consult al-Azhar or go back to the church. So it's always in these matters. But when it comes to other laws, like for example, investment, we will find other arguments such as, okay, let's go beyond religion. Let's ask about technology, how the modern world is affecting the law. But there is no effect of the religious authorities whatsoever on laws such as investments. It's only affecting people's lives. Currently we have 2 laws affecting the family issues. The one for Muslims that was issued in 1920. So it's 101 years old this year, with a very few amendments and changes that are not substantial to the equality part. It's rather regarding maybe something related to alimonies, some procedural issues, but not about the substance or the philosophy of the law itself. And then we have another one for what we called the 1938 bylaws, and this is the one governing Christians' family issues in Egypt. And for some reason also, it's put on hold sometimes. So this law, or these bylaws, give Christians in Egypt the right to have divorce for 9 reasons. In practice, they are only allowed 3, and they do not get it all the time. Next slide, please. So what's happening now in Egypt? There are some, we have been called as organization or as civil society, we have been calling for reforming the person status law for both Muslims and Christians. We work based on international conventions, the constitution, progressive interpretations of fiqh or religious texts. But what's happening on this specific moment? First of all, there are 2 proposals right now are being discussed. The first one is regarding the one that's supposed to govern the Christian family law or the Christian personal status law. But we as civil society, or we as society in general, we have no idea whatsoever what is being discussed, simply because the state is discussing this in a very secret way with the churches without any involvement for anyone, including Christians themselves. So this is number one. Why the secrecy? Honestly, this is something that's going to affect everyone's life. Why the secrecy? When it comes to the Muslim draft, the one that is proposed currently in the parliament, that draft is proposed by the cabinet. And they said they have consulted with the National Council for Women, National Council for Motherhood and Childhood, Al-Azhar, of course. So they have already consulted several other institutions. But yet the proposal still does not tackle the main issues that the women face every day in courts. So for example, we still have verbal divorce in place. Guardianship is getting stronger, and that is what women now, like her guardian can annul her marriage if the marriage is not consummated. So he has 1 year to annul the marriage based on the fact that it's this husband or this man is incompetent, and the incompetency here refers to al-mahr or the dowry. So it's basically as if they are talking about not marriage, it's selling a product somehow, which is very humiliating to women. If this is the competency is only regarding dowry, then this is an issue that we have to talk about. Still no talk or no addressing of the wilaya or guardianship over children by mothers. Up till this moment, mothers have to go to court to get the educational guardianship, for example, for her children, while it's an automatic right to the father. And on financial cases, she has no wilaya at all. She has no power whatsoever on her kids' financial rights. Next slide, please. And I'm going to wrap up that. So how did the community respond? Actually, there was a huge refusal of the proposal online and offline. Even we have many women and many men talking about why they are against that, because of the guardianship articles, because of the polygamy, because it does not restrict polygamy per se. It actually give it some room. So the men they have to inform their wives, otherwise they are going to get to jail. But with the procedures, they can get away with it. So they either jail or fine. But again, the women will be have no say whatsoever over that. The custody itself, there is a fight over it because there are no clear legal steps on what will be done if the non-custodial parent kidnapped the child, how the state is going to deal with that. It's not also clear. With the DNA testings, DNA is still not obligatory in that sense, while mothers cannot cannot prove paternity unless they have to go to courts and also file a case and all of that. Men can take any child and say, well, this is my child, and can document it. So these are the main issues in the proposed law. And then the second thing, there has been a campaign going on, an online campaign called Al-Wilaya Haqqi, or Guardianship is My Right, where women are specifically mentioning cases and problems they have faced throughout their lives just because they are women, just because the law does not give them their rights. So this is an overview of what's happening. And sorry, I took longer than my time. Hope that give you an overview of what needed to be done in the future. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you, Neda, for sharing that. And truly, it's, again, this idea of selective use of religious authority, but especially when it affects people's lives, when it affects women's lives and women's bodily autonomy and women's decision-making, and ability to be in public and private spaces as fully autonomous humans, right? And you raised this also important point here, where people's lives have changed so much in the past 100 years that it's hard to stay silent in the face of outdated laws that are continuing to be upheld as the status quo, especially when you as activists within SILA and lawyers are being faced with how this affects people in their daily lives and the difficulties and the hardships that they experience because of these outdated laws that have not been changed to reflect the realities that they're living in today, such as mothers taking care of the children's education, contributing to household income, DNA testing, all of these things that are specificities that are not named in the Quran, but again, as activists, if we fall back on this idea of trajectory of justice, then the changes have to also reflect that journey as well. In making consultations with particular groups to change, but are women's rights groups being consulted? Are women themselves being consulted about the changes that need to happen in order to make their lives better? Whose voices make it to representation? I think these are really important points that you've brought up here. And a great segue actually into Hala. Let me call on you now. SIHA operates in the Greater Horn of Africa, where we see a diversity of plural legal systems. In countries, you work in Ethiopia, in South Sudan, in Uganda, in Sudan, Djibouti. I feel like I'm missing a couple here, I apologize. But you see an interplay of customary and civil and religious laws, both codified and uncodified, that govern marriage and family issues. At SIHA Network, as one of the main organizations choosing to engage with religion in the region, you've mentioned in past webinars that you've done with both Musawah and with SIHA that was a difficult decision to make. You were isolated from the movement. Your credibility was affected. And you faced scrutiny and sometimes more threats from Islamists in the region who wanted to push forward this particular idea of Islam and Islamic laws and how things should be done. And so it was an uphill battle on multiple fronts for you. Can you talk about the thinking behind that strategic decision to engage with religion nonetheless from a rights perspective? And how did you deal with those challenges?
Thank you very much, Alex. I hope you can hear me well. So,
Yes.
great. Yeah, so, I mean, and thank you for asking these very, very important questions, because, you know, we consider ourselves a women's rights organization and a feminist organization that works with women regardless of who they are, or regardless of their faith and cultural backgrounds, or, you know, sexual orientations and so on. So we definitely have, you know, we are actually, you know, respect to the diversity of the women movement, you know, and to the diversity of women in this part of the world is critical and important part of our work. Having said that, you know, the reality is we are working in the Greater Horn of Africa across 7 countries where there is a majority Muslim population. Even countries that they don't see themselves that have a majority Muslim population, a country like Ethiopia, for example, which has, I think, a population of close to 120 million, I would say at least over 35% of them are Muslims. So, so that's very telling about the number of Muslim women within the Greater Horn of Africa. A country like Uganda, you have about 14% Muslim. Other countries like Eritrea, or you know, also it's at least 30%, you know, or I hope my numbers are correct, but I believe it's around that. And then you have a predominantly it's always tricky with the data when it comes to religion. It's one of the most interesting data to review, you know, so it's very much, it depends on where it comes from, but we are really looking at the lived realities of the, you know, of the women and of the communities that we are working with, a predominantly Muslim community in Somalia, Somaliland, and in Sudan, and in Djibouti. So ultimately, you know, if we are positioning ourselves as a feminist organization that works on gender equality, that concerns about the violation that women are experiencing, that concern about issues of economic justice and so on, you know, we have to show an understanding and respect, you know, to the context of those women, and to the identity of those women. Who are those women? And also the identity of many of us, you know, who are, you know, raised and grew up, you know, and see ourselves as feminists, but also as Muslims. So this dichotomy that many of the feminist organizations who works in different parts of the world, and particularly Muslim communities, you know, that often we observe, and we went through it, you know, where you are basically using the human rights framework in isolation from the culture and the traditions, you know, and the, you know, and the identity of the women we are working with, you know, by experience, we found out that this is largely problematic, and we have to be respectful, and we have to connect, you know, to the women that we are working with, and you know, just recognizing this, it was very, very clear for us that there is no escape from engaging and trying to understand, you know, religion and how it affects women, and how does women see their position from religion and interact with it away from the imposed religion that was, you know, meant to control women, meant to undermine them, and meant to dehumanize them. And I think our experience with Musawah, and, you know, and before that, you know, being exposed to the experience of sister in Islam has been extremely helpful. But I would say our experience with Musawah has been very, very critical, introducing us to the knowledge and to the methodology that help us in terms of how we can navigate, the enlightened Muslim heritage, and how we can actually share that, with the women groups and the women population that we are working with. The other important thing, that we are working in a region that's largely dominated by militant Islam. The Greater Horn of Africa, it became like a playground for for militant Islamists, which is really a problematic issue, because what they did, they basically controlled the discourse and the narrative. And central in the militant Islamist discourse is the position and the situation of women. So guardianship, it became something that nobody could talk about it. The fact that women are below men, it became a fact. Child marriage, it became a reality. Criminalizations of women's sexuality and all persecutions of women, tendency to criminalize women for their dress codes, for presence in public spaces. The other important issue that we struggle with in this part of the world is to what extent religion is used as a direct threat to women's peace and security. Women are getting killed, for trying to get an education, getting killed for being on the streets, trying to earn a living, or they are getting imprisoned, for trying to earn a living or vending or and things like that. So the overall construct is really utilized, empowered by the ideology of militant Islam that found, a very fertile soil in this part of the world. And we decided that there is no other choice other than, to be very open and to be for us, if you want to be relevant, and if we want to connect, and if we want to influence change. And it has been a journey that we started very, very lowly, but I mean, at the moment, I would say that there is a lot of activists who are joining in and really having an understanding of why it's important to reclaim a very important part of our identity and who we are. Yeah, back to you, Alex.
Hala, thank you. And that last sentence there about reclaiming your identity and to try to do this amid all of the different challenges that you just brought up, all of the different contextual forces that are acting upon you as activists. And I just want to point out another point that you had mentioned earlier, where data is tricky when it comes to religion, and yet it's so integral to being able to push for reform in order to use that as evidence for new policy making, for the ways that it affects people's lives. Because if it cannot be counted, then the general wisdom is that then it cannot be changed. And yet, so it becomes very important then for activists like you and all of you really to be documenting the various ways that these different laws, policies, practices are affecting women in order to even be able to start to put a stop to discrimination and to envision a better way forward. And I think to follow up on your mention of economic justice as well, I think that again is a perfect segue for, let me call on Nurjihan now and to talk about the context in India. BMMA has carved its place as the Indian Muslim women's movement within this interesting context where 195 million Muslims are a minority community that's currently being ruled by a conservative right-wing Modi government, which has also been accused of Islamophobic state actions. Yet you as BMMA have chosen to engage with this government and somehow have managed to bring the issue of Muslim women's rights in the family into national conversation. including a huge victory when the Indian Supreme Court banned triple talaq divorce, whereby a man could unilaterally divorce his wife by saying talaq three times. And BMMA was the lead petitioner in that case. And since then, you've done such important work. You've spoken before about the pushback that you've received throughout this from other feminists in India, from the government, from the Muslim communities that you're trying to help and represent. Why do it? What were some of your experiences and successful strategies to push the needle on reform, given the environment that you're in? And if you could talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you, Musawah, for this opportunity. Yeah, it's been last 13 years that we've been consistently demanding a comprehensively codified Muslim family law. And the process began as soon as BMMA was formed, and we spent about 8 years actually drafting a law and preparing a comprehensive draft law. And since 2014, we've been reaching out to all state governments, the national government, and all the commissions, the Women's Commission, and have been asking for a debate and a discussion in order to have a comprehensive law. Now, why am I saying comprehensive so many times? Because we got independence 73 years back. Our first legislation by the British government came in 1937, yeah, which kind of established that the Muslims are going to be governed by the Sharia law and not by any other cultural practices or anything else. So Sharia was established as the groundwork or the guiding principle for family matters like marriage and divorce. Then the next legislation, a very concrete legislation, came in 1939, which allowed Muslim women to have divorce by going to the court. And then straight the next law, so to say, the second comprehensive or a bit of comprehensive law came in 1986. So we had good 47 years where nothing happened. Absolutely nothing happened, and we were not governed by a parliamentary act or a law, but by customs and traditions, which were guided by religious groups and extremely patriarchal and discriminatory. After 1986, the next legislation came in 2019, which is almost like 33 years after the last legislation. So our concern is that, are we going to spend like 30 years, 40 years in between two small pieces of legislation? And how long are we going to be waiting? And when is this right time going to come? We've been told all along as Muslim women, the time is not right. This government is Islamophobic. A lot of lynchings are happening. Earlier, there was set of riots that happened in Gujarat. Then there were other parts of the country which were engulfed in communal violence with state complicity. And every time we were told, this is not the right time, let's not talk about Sharia, let's not talk about family law, this is not the right time. So my question has always been, when is this right time going to come to us for Muslim women? And so that's the push, that's the factor which made us work towards the drafting of the family law, and which also made us go to the Supreme Court with a petition against triple talaq, halala, and polygamy. For some reason, the Supreme Court chose to pick up just triple talaq, and we had a good judgment followed by a legislation. So this has been the journey so far. So our demand has always been that let us have a comprehensive law which talks about all issues: polygamy, child marriage, inheritance, adoption, maintenance, meher amount, age of marriage, everything that comes within the Muslim family law framework. Also a bit of a complexity in the Indian context is we have personal laws which are separate for each religious community. So we have the Hindu law for the Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, and the Jains. We have the Muslim family law, which is like half-baked. And then we have a comprehensive law for the Christian community, although they are such a small minority. And for even a smaller minority, the Parsis also have their own codified law. And we being the largest minority, we are still struggling with that. The trick is that we also have civil laws or laws which are concerning family matters, which are applicable to all the citizens of the country. So for instance, we have 494 IPC, the Indian Penal Code, which is against polygamy. and which has a 7-year imprisonment for the man who indulges in polygamy. So by default, as a citizen, that law applies to me. But because of the 1937 Sharia Act, which says Sharia is applicable, this law doesn't apply to me. And nobody is clear. There's nothing written down anywhere in the books of law that 494 doesn't apply to Muslim women, but there's an assumption and understanding that it doesn't apply. Same thing for the PCMA, the Prevention of Child Marriage Act. Again, by default, as a citizen, it is applicable to me. But there's an understanding with everyone that it is not applicable to the Muslims. They're exempt. So the way out is to have a comprehensive law, a law which talks about the rules, the regulations, all the issues with all the penalties, everything in one place, so that everybody knows, the courts, the police, the community, the women, everybody knows what is there in store for us. And yes, pushback, yes, a lot of resistance from the religious group, a lot of resistance from feminist groups, because why are you talking about religion at all? Also from secular groups, where, as I said earlier, this is not the right time. This government is using you. You are the stooges of this government, and you are being used by this government. So don't talk about it. And you are un-Islamic, and all of those things have been happening. But for us, the strategy and the way out is to just keep talking about it. Just keep talking about it, and maybe the time will come when we will have this comprehensive legislation for us. Yes, Alex.
Thank you, Nurjahan. And this idea that the question that you just asked, why are you talking about religion at all? That is at the heart of this webinar. I mean, that's Absolutely. In the title itself, right? Reconciling Religion and Rights. And this idea that everyone here in this room and a lot of the advocates who are part of Musawah and who have come before us and who will come after us have to come up against this rock and a hard place of people saying that you shouldn't engage with religion because it grants religion this space in public space that it really should not have, this dominance in public space, and yet to not engage with it cedes the ground to the most conservative voices and allows for the upholding of an idea of Islam that really at the heart of it does not benefit women and can be misused by those in power to, in fact, discriminate against women and girls. And I also wanted to tie that to what you said just now about being told the time is not right. And I think a lot of the women's rights activists in the room tuning in right now, everyone has heard this at some point. The time is not right. The time's not right for reform. When is the time right? When is it your time? When is it our time? And really what you've shown through BMMA's work is that you make your own time. And Hala mentioned earlier that guardianship was an issue that nobody could talk about. And so what you just said about you keep talking about it, you keep moving the conversation along and bringing that up in the public sphere, you keep the conversation going, the discourse going to bring people's lived realities into the reality of everyone around them. That ties back to what Sherry was saying earlier about the work of CIS, is that CIS started out with writing letters to the editor and writing op-eds and really bringing this alternative discourse into the public discourse, the mainstream discourse, so that the ideas that everyone held could be shaken up a little bit, could be challenged, and that new ways could be brought in. And with new ways, there's the possibility of reform for the people who have been traditionally marginalized and discriminated against. So thank you for bringing up those points. Because I think that will be really important too, now that we've talked about the religion and rights portion, and touched on the hope that we all find in this work towards securing equality and justice in Muslim family laws. But I also want to acknowledge the fact that this month marks 1 year since COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic, and how the restrictions and the lockdowns of pandemic living have necessarily changed the nature of your work in all of your contexts, and in Musawah's context at the global level as well. So on the one hand, suddenly it's like there's this global spotlight on women's double burden. and unpaid labor and care work within the home, on domestic violence and IPV, on the multitudes of gendered impacts of and intersectional ways that inequalities in the home disproportionately make women more vulnerable. And as activists fighting for women's rights, you all have been on the front lines of seeing how our various systems in national contexts, in regional contexts, even in international contexts, how those systems have failed to address the institutional barriers that perpetuate discrimination against women. And in fact, in some contexts, added new ways of making it worse, from governmental ordinances that didn't account for the precarity of women's informal work, to court closures that removed women's access to justice by obstructing divorces in custody cases. There are tons of cases that each of you have personally encountered in your context that prove this point. And going into 2020, Musawah had planned to launch our campaign for justice in Muslim family laws to leverage the Beijing Plus 25 and Generation Equality Forum to raise awareness for the centrality of reforming discriminatory family laws to achieve equality for women and girls in Muslim contexts. Yet the reality of pandemic 2020 put paid to that plan. So I'd like to turn again to my colleague Hishama. Tell us about this campaign for justice, which you coordinate, and why is it important to mobilize as activists, as scholars, as women's rights, people who are interested in women's rights now more than ever. And if you could talk about some of the findings too of the COVID survey that you ran through Musawah, which was launched on International Women's Day this year.
Thanks, Alex, for the set of questions. I actually want to tackle them in order of our current context, right? So yes, absolutely, Musawah, went ahead and tried to, we actually launched our campaign for justice in Muslim family laws. The reasoning behind the campaign and the objectives of the campaign, I will explain in a little bit. But last year did dampen, a lot of our plans, right? And so if we were to say, when is the right time? Probably not a pandemic year, but women's groups did it anyway, as did we, and the work continues despite the pandemic. But what I really want to do is start with some of the survey findings, because I want to ground the campaign for justice in this context that we found ourselves grappling with. So in July 2020, Musawah launched a survey, and it was a qualitative survey on the impacts to find out the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on women living under discriminatory Muslim family laws, because we did not want to do the work of family law reforms or the advocacy on family law reforms in a vacuum. Right, this was a major shift in our in our lives and in the agenda of governments, and so we really wanted to ground what was happening to Muslim women living under Muslim family laws during the pandemic. And it was really interesting because so we did the survey across 12 countries, but we essentially had women's rights activists who helped us identify some of the key issues emerging pertaining specifically to Muslim family laws and court systems. But then we did a 3-month, we supplemented it with 3-month qualitative research as well to look at what was the data, what was the research coming out on the impacts of the pandemic. And interestingly, the findings showed us an increase in child and forced marriage in multiple societal, with multiple societal and financially contributing factors, increase in rates of domestic violence, which escalated significantly, a major increase in unpaid care work, as you mentioned, with women juggling multiple responsibilities, including the burden of schoolwork, livelihood, and so on. There were also polygamy-related financial problems that women had shared, and women who had faced an increase in vulnerability to unilateral talaq, divorce. Divorce and separation-related problems was also a major factor, particularly in resolving child custody and guardianship. And in addition to this, we also, respondents also indicated delays in court procedures and court systems, primarily because of movement restrictions and lockdowns. But in courts that did function for whatever limited extent, family law related cases were mostly deprioritized and were triaged, right? So were taken much later than other cases. So Musawah then determined that based on these findings, the impacts, that women face are as a direct result of the absence of egalitarian family laws and effective court systems. And yes, it's happening across the world, but many of the issues that were reported from Muslim contexts were ones that were exacerbated by the discriminatory provisions and procedures in family law. The fact that child and forced marriage was allowed, the fact that polygamy and unequal divorce was allowed by family laws under normal circumstances, meant that the pandemic offered alternative or additional reasons, additional contributing factors, and excuses for such issues to occur in greater numbers, with greater frequency, and of course with greater consequences. So the root we see is that the laws allow it, and that is the problem, right? And of course there are short-term solutions that permeate across boundaries, but in terms of addressing the real discrimination that Muslim women face, it comes down to those discriminatory laws and policies and laws and practices within Muslim family laws. And so I want to ground this in then the Campaign for Justice, which we launched in a pandemic year. The real basis for it is that any law or practice that deem adult women as minors under the guardianship of male family members inherently allows for the same society, community, and country in which these laws apply to control women's actions, decisions, and life choices. And what does that mean? It means that it places limitations on women's citizenship rights, social, political, economic, and cultural rights. So no, family laws are not only restricted to families, they actually impact women in all spheres of their life. And therefore, they're no longer tenable in our present day. But as my fellow activist friends and amazing advocates working in that context will report, we see overwhelmingly that there's significant resistance to reform of Muslim family laws in various contexts. And there are several arguments that are used commonly against reforms in all these contexts. In fact, they're quite common across the different Muslim contexts, and these are often on religious grounds, right? So conservative groups and governments argue that these are God-given, that these are divine, and therefore any attempt to change such laws, they say, is going against Islam, which is the problem. But not only do we know now that these laws fail to fulfill the Sharia requirements of contemporary notions of justice, they're also used to deny women their rights and dignified choices in life. And these elements are actually at the root of disharmony and breakdown of families. So our family laws are currently doing much more harm than any intention of good. And that is precisely against the Islamic principles of equality and justice. And so over the past decade, scholarship and activism in the Muslim world, as we see, has developed to make the case for the possibility and the necessity of family law reforms. There's growing evidence, as we see from all these contexts and globally, that many provisions in Muslim family laws as defined by the classical jurists is no longer tenable in our current context, and they cannot be defended on Islamic grounds anymore. So there's nothing to fear in terms of engaging with religion because the evidence to back up reform is now here, right? And there's also recognition now by women's rights activists around the world that religion, ideology, culture, and tradition can no longer be used to justify discrimination against women and girls. And as you can see, witnessed from this call, and there's many more women's rights activists out there working on these issues, there's a historic sisterhood and scholarship of Muslim women from all over the world, fighting for and advocating for justice and equality within their communities. And it is this that led us to identify the need and the potential of a campaign for justice in Muslim family laws, which I will very quickly say is really attempting to build that global momentum. We want to put this issue on the agenda of our own governments, on the agenda of international community and treaty bodies, as well as women's rights movements, that family law reform is a women's rights and human rights issue. And in fact, the COVID-19 pandemic has spotlighted home and family as important places of health and well-being and security for women. And we've been told to stay home, to stay safe. or what have you. So it is now, with this pandemic, much more obvious than any other time that there can be no equality for women in society without equality in the family. So it is now, since the pandemic and before, a global human rights issue.
Thank you, Hishama. That was a wonderful snapshot that, you know, I think we should just clip that and send that to all policymakers, send it across the world, everywhere, because really this link that you made between how women are denied rights within families extends into the discrimination that they face in societies through discriminatory family laws, and how difficult that is to recognize and to dismantle. It's so important to why we're doing this work, why Musawah launched this campaign for justice in Muslim family laws, why that's so important, and why, despite the fact that the pandemic might have scuppered a lot of different plans that we had, why it was so important to do that anyway. And folks, please go read the survey report for more details on the specifics, because I think it'll be really interesting to hear directly from what the activists reported in July 2020, but also to see some of the qualitative research that really builds these arguments and builds the evidence for making reforms happen in these different contexts in order to make women's lives better. And so thank you, Hishama, for sharing those. And I think my colleague has shared it in the chat as well, the link. So please do check out that survey report. So now, again, that we've relied on Hishama to tie into why was it so important to mobilize, to launch this campaign for justice during a COVID year. Looking back a year later, I want to now turn to the rest of our speakers and give you some space to talk about how did the pandemic change the realities of women in the communities that you serve? And thus, how did that change the ways that you engaged with religion and rights in your work? And if we could start with Nada, I know that Sula had also conducted a study. And so if you could start with that and talk just about the situation that you faced in Egypt last year during the COVID-19 pandemic and coming into this year.
Thank you so much, Alex, again. So yes, at SULA, we've conducted a study on the effects of COVID-19 on the social, economic, and psychological aspects of women's lives. So the study sample was 121 women from our beneficiaries, and we are a grassroots organization, so we work directly with women in marginalized areas. The study, it was conducted by our social workers, psychological workers, and people working on economic justice from within our organization as well. And we had sets of questions. What we noticed, because once COVID hit Egypt, everyone was not clear about what can be done now, what was going on, whether organizations, the states, families themselves, everyone was confused. I believe that it hit Egypt on the 15th of March, like today. And we started afterwards, the lockdown started, and we had curfew and some other restrictions. After a month, we decided, because we published our numbers, so these are the hotlines for women who needed interventions. And what we noticed during that is that there is an increase in number of calls on violence against women, but the numbers were different, or the forms of violence that was different from before Corona, for example. So in the sample, as you can see, we found that 63% of those women were subjected to domestic abuse, for example. In domestic abuse, it was not only physical, but it was also economic and psychological. So in the next slide, you will see that out of the 63%, in the next slide, 42% were subjected, no, the one before, 42% were subjected to violence for the first time ever in their lives. That was during Corona. It was because of the lockdown. Everyone was on their nerves, and in the study itself, we had a question whether or not Corona was. Do you think that it has positive sides or negative sides? And about 35% of the families or women in the family said it had negative sides. Of course, 56%, they were saying there are some positives, there are some negatives about the family coming together, but 35% is an alarming percentage. And that says a lot about the fact that how women are treated in the family. This is number one. Also, the lack of any sort of awareness or intervention or law that combats violence against women. That gave some sort of impunity to perpetrators, that they knew that, for example, the calls about gatherings or reporting gatherings and reporting COVID cases would get much more attention than reporting violence, for example. In the next slide, the violence was not only about physical aspects. Well, actually 59% of the study sample were subjected to psychological violence. Women were telling us simply that I'm under continuous stress. I'm told I'm not enough, that I'm worthless, and this is something that I cannot go to my family and tell them that he's treating me badly, for example, because simply he's not hitting me. 59% had psychological issues and psychological pressure and violence, and the law itself, it does not even take into consideration physical violence as of, like, we don't have combating violence against women law. And since we don't have that, there is no recognition of the psychological violence in the first place. In the comments,
Nada, you just become muted again.
Sorry. In the chat, I sent you the link to the study with the charts, with all how we conducted this research and the study, and the different effects on the economic and social and psychological aspects. You can take a look at that, and I believe the numbers might be a little bit shocking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nada, for sharing that survey that you did. And folks, again, please do check out this report and the link that Nada just shared in the chat, because I think this is, again, really important this is providing data, right? So if people are saying we need data in order to work on policies, in order to show evidence that the community does in fact want to change, you need to change, these kinds of reports are really crucial to making that argument and to really documenting what is going on in women's lives, particularly during a pandemic year when so much of those lives are hidden, when, as Hisham pointed out, a lot of us are being told to stay at home. And a lot of us then encounter discriminatory practices and laws that affect us in a way that further is invisibilized because we no longer have this public tangible space to come out and be discriminated against in public, I suppose. So this is really important that you are cataloging both these experiences that women are going through, but also that you are putting it in a way that it's very strong evidence for reform, and to really show how women are being affected during this pandemic in Egypt. So thank you, Nada, for sharing that. Can I call on one of my other speakers to follow up with that? Sherry, what happened with the women in Malaysia during the pandemic?
Let me just, can you hear me or am I on mute?
Nope, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks for the question, Alex. I just want to say that I think with regards to Hishama's presentation just now on the findings, I think for Malaysia, we can almost tick every box in regards to what's happened in Malaysia. Definitely in terms of, you know, the way we operated, the pandemic and the restrictions on mobility, that was a huge challenge for us to continue our work. Because our work, you know, centered around face-to-face engagements, and we could not do this anymore. And in that sense, this area became sort of invisible. You know, you did not have any connection or contact when it came to issues like this. But you know, we moved quite quickly, and our first priority, our first move was to secure and ensure the availability, the continued availability of our hotline, Telenisa, which provides Sharia legal advice. So we moved it from you know, the line in the office to a WhatsApp number. I think we had a few months where the uptake was very low. It was very worrying because we didn't, you know, we couldn't analyze whether it was because they couldn't reach out or because there were no issues. We didn't think it was the latter. But thankfully, after maybe about 2 months, the numbers have come up. They spiked up a bit, and now they're pretty much back to the average normal numbers. You know. And then early on also through our Telenisa calls, the main issue that women were calling in for was the fact that they were finding it hard to put food on the table, you know, very basic needs at that point in time. So we organized, I mean, we don't organize fundraising for these purposes, but we generally, we quickly organize between ourselves and our supporters to support and provide and transport some food provisions to the families that we've been in contact with, you know, some basic provisions like rice, oil, eggs, and so on. The other area that we faced was domestic violence. Yeah, definitely. I'll give you some numbers. Like in February, our lockdown started in March. In February, the calls that went into Women's Aid Organization, which is one of the focal NGOs for domestic violence, was 250 calls. In March, it went up to 350 calls. And by April, when we were like, you know, very much into the lockdown, it was close to 900 calls. And the women's ministry, their hotline, registered calls increased by about almost 60%. So it registered very drastically, very quickly. Yeah, and the worrying issue was that you know, the public services seem to have stalled. You know, at one point in time, the hotline itself, the government hotline, was not, I think, in operation. So we had to deal with this. I mean, there was a government response. They reopened the hotline again, and eventually set out a committee to look at, you know, what kind of response is required to tackle this very, you know, this issue that was growing so rapidly, so quickly. Another big problem, I think also Hishama mentioned this, is that the Sharia courts were completely closed. And so all the cases were stalled, and so we were getting calls about, what do I do with my interim protection order that's going to expire in a few days, and the courts are not open, and I can't extend that protection order, and I'm worried for my safety. There were other issues of interim custodial orders, custody of their children. There were issues about visitation rights. How do I meet my meet the court order to allow my husband visitation rights when, I can't travel, he can't travel, and there are, I think they were worried about whether the court could take action against them or whether the husband could take action against them for not giving the husband visitation rights, and so on and so forth. So many types of issues that were coming up during this period. So, and we didn't have answers either. Even the lawyers weren't quite sure what was going on because there was no one in court to give clarification. So we reached out to the chief judge of the Sharia court and gave him a whole list of questions, that we were facing for I think at that point in time it was about 2 or 3 weeks into the lockdown. And thankfully he responded with a few YouTube videos clarifying all these questions and also dealing with issues of domestic violence and, from an Islamic as well as a legal point of view. So that was, quite a good thing that came out of that. And then as things went on and we realized that this is not like a few weeks or even a month. It looks like it's going to go on, for quite a long time. We became quite worried that we had, that we were going to lose touch with all our stakeholders, all our supporters, people who have been, with us along this journey. So we decided to have a weekly webinar. It's called Telenisa Tel. So we banked on Telenisa, the hotline. And based on the kind of questions that were coming in, so we had the webinar. So we had, we dealt with questions on what's happening with the Sharia courts. We dealt with questions on domestic violence. Then we talked about, the economic toll of the lockdown. Then we went on to other issues that were interesting to women, like small businesses, entrepreneurship through online platforms, having your children at home and having lessons online and how that was, how mothers were coping with that. And most recently we had one on vaccination, on the COVID vaccination, which in Malaysia we started earlier this month. So a whole host of issues. It's been very popular. We have between 2,000 to 4,000 followers, so that's kept us in contact with our audience. That's very important for us, so that we don't lose the momentum, as we come out of the pandemic. But like law reform and policy and for Muslim family law, that's been almost completely stalled. The other issue that in tandem with the lockdown and the pandemic, we had a change in government, what we call a backdoor government, practically about the same time. So Parliament wasn't sitting, and there were all these political games going on, and the priority seemed to be, it is either conserving power by the government or, somehow trying to get power by the opposition. Those things were all over the newspapers. And there was very little about, anything else really. There was only COVID and all these political issues. So we're still in that situation somewhat. Actually, in Malaysia now, the government has declared an emergency because of COVID. They're trying to introduce fake news laws, which look pretty draconian. Today, we got news that, you see, the Islamist Party is part of this new government coalition. Today, we have news that now they have a 5-year plan to strengthen Sharia laws, particularly criminal laws, and to introduce new laws to, you know, strengthen the Sharia system generally. So, I mean, we have a challenging way ahead coming out of the lockdown. I think if at all there was a silver lining, I think what became very clear is that is the extent of marginalization of women. You know, and there are many people on the ground that have started being very vocal about how they, you know, they have not received support during this very difficult period while, you know, the leaders are playing their games, things like that. So there's a lot of anger, and there's a lot of, I think, dissatisfaction with the fact that, you know, women are suffering more than many other groups. Of course, there are other vulnerable groups, the refugees, etc., but women is one large portion of marginalized group in the society. So that's become very apparent, and yeah, hopefully that will, coming out of this, it will be an impetus for, you know, for real and substantive change. So yeah, so this has become somewhat of a new norm. We've become comfortable with online, you know, webinars, study sessions, whatever, workshops, meetings, and so on. I mean, our work pretty much continues. All our campaigns have continued, you know, limited to online. So we're expecting this hopefully to end in the, you know, vaccinations have started. So hopefully we'll get back to some form of how we were before the pandemic soon enough, sooner rather than later.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Sherry, thank you for sharing that contextual kind of all the different things that are happening that you had to deal with. And it's quite worrisome to hear about this strengthening of Sharia laws, especially considering the historical role that that's played in the past in upholding discriminatory family laws. But also I think it's important to note here that keeping Telenisa running was probably a lifesaver for a lot of Malaysian women to be able to continue to seek help and to learn more about their rights, especially in such a changing environment. And when you spoke about public services stalling, I'm sure many people also encountered that in different contexts. But luckily, at least in Malaysia, the women's rights groups stepped into that breach to try to meet the community's needs. And so I think that that's really an important thing to bring up, in addition to the marginalization, the increased marginalization that women faced, but also the role that women's rights groups and the movement had in stepping up to be able to mitigate some of those more excessive impacts on people in their daily lives. And I know that you also had talked about the economic repercussions of the lockdown. And Nurjahan, I know you have some points to speak to that there about the situation in India. So if I can turn to you, what was happening for the women in India during the pandemic?
Yeah, so things were pretty bad, considering that to start with, the Muslim community in India has been marginalized. I mean, the Sachar Committee report came a decade back, already established that the Muslim community in India is extremely backward socially, economically, educationally. So the COVID situation simply added to the marginalization. It simply added to the vulnerability of the entire community. Also considering that Muslims in India are largely urban, stay in urban centers, largely involved in informal, irregular economy, which anyway has been difficult because last 30 years we've been following a capitalist agenda where labor has become cheaper. It's easy to do away with people, and the labor laws have become very pro-capitalist, and so given that situation and the fact that we are marginalized, the fact that we've been backward all these decades, this situation simply added to the whole scenario. Other than that, just before COVID, the year previous to that was also very difficult for the Muslim community, because the government came up with this law, the Citizenship Amendment Act, and the National Registry, where religion was to become, or has rather become, the criteria for citizenship. This law is in place even now, although there was a national protest and we're still wondering what is happening to that law, but it's been passed by the parliament. So that year itself was difficult. And with the COVID, the government really messed up with the implementation of the lockdown. They announced it like just 4 hours prior to the lockdown implementation, where people were stranded, especially the Muslims who stay in urban centers, who have their homes in villages. They're completely stranded. The transport system was completely blocked, and people have walked miles and miles, kilometers to reach their home places. Our work with the community actually came down to providing ration and basic survival. I mean, it was really sad to see that we had to do that after so many years of independence, and a country which is claiming to be developing and developed. We're talking about survival. We're talking about how do we make people survive? How do we have people to eat food? So that was difficult. For women, it was difficult to access the police, because the entire police force was employed by the government to implement the lockdown. So we had police, hitting people who were out on the streets, a lot of violence. And so the entire police force was engaged to implement the lockdown. And so women who were facing domestic violence, women who wanted police help were able to do that. On our part, we were able to actually rescue some women from their homes, and with the help of the police, we were able to do some of it. But largely, a lot of women were not able to access the police. Of course, the courts were not functioning. So all the cases which were pending in the courts were all left high and dry. We had the Hindutva forces who actually came up with something like a Corona jihad. And that was really, it was crazy, because this was in reference to the Jamaat members who were holding a meeting at the time of the lockdown. It was a pre-planned meeting, and then lockdown happened. But no opportunity was lost to make the Muslim community the scapegoats or the reasons for the corona spreading across the country. And they actually came up with something like a term called Corona jihad, which was, it's difficult to even explain how it feels when you are put in a spotlight like this, and at a time when all of us were suffering. So for us, the issue was, how do we keep the issue of Muslim family law alive in these difficult times, not just the COVID situation, but also the Islamophobic government that is not losing even one opportunity to put down the community. So that has been difficult. Survival has become and it is still an issue. Communalization of the pandemic was an issue that we faced, and we had to encounter that. And the fact that women were not, the police systems, the state structures were inaccessible to women who were facing violence, and the large question of how do we keep talking about this issue. Yes, Alex.
Thank you, Nurjan. That's again really helpful to get an idea of what's happening in India, and this idea of Corona jihad is also mind-boggling. We're running a little bit short on time, so if I can turn really quickly to Hala, can you tell us a little bit about what's been happening in the Greater Horn of Africa, or any of the countries really that SIHA works in?
So, Alex, I mean, what COVID has done is that it exposed the artificial benchmarks that majority of our government has been actually putting, as a sign of progress when it comes to issues of human rights, particularly the whole issue of women political participation that dictates the conversation. I'm not saying that it's not important; it's very, very important. But when it becomes, the main issue, again, is issues of economic justice, again, is issues of social protection, and undermining a critical and important and a political issue, in my view, like family law, that affect every aspect of women's lives, that becomes problematic. So basically, when COVID happened, it was evident that, none of the countries, even the countries that, they claim that they are committed to human rights and they have sort of laws and policies that are responsive, to the violence against women. There is no whatsoever an active or effective policy in place that was able to help or to protect women. So the poverty, has increased significantly. And the closure of schools particularly had affected millions of girls in this region who were found themselves either they were given away for marriage, or they became pregnant. So the percentages of teen pregnancy, for example, have increased significantly in countries like Ethiopia, like Uganda. Child marriage has increased significantly in South Sudan. There is millions and millions of girls who will not make it back to school, unfortunately, because the governments in this part of the world, they had no vision, or any plan kind of to take this critical and important issue into considerations. We are working in a conflict zone, so issues of women, peace and security has really worsened during COVID times. Most of the people, they assume, who are living in conflict zones, they assume marginal jobs. With COVID, of course, rotational markets were not, people were not able, to do that, and so all this negativity, it interpreted into violence, and particularly violence against women. Sexual violence has increased significantly also across the region, and so on. So we had a few incidents of gender killings or femicides that has been happening in Somalia and Sudan, and so on. So the bottom line is the political structure, our governments, they are not really. COVID has exposed the fact that they don't have clear plans, to deal with, or actual plans to protect women in times of crisis, or a mechanism that could actually provide any sort of protections or economic support to the women who are considered to be the majority of poor in the, Back to you, Alex.
Sorry, Hala, I think we missed just that last sentence.
So basically what I was saying, that it turned out, as I said, I was just repeating what I said earlier, that the majority of governments, they don't have policies in place to respond during emergency situations, particularly when it comes, to the supporting women economically or to provide any form of protections.
Wonderful, thank you. And again, such important work that you're doing in the region to really bring these issues to light. Yes,
Hello?
yes, I can hear you, Hala. Yes, thank you. And so right now, because we're running a little bit short on time, I'm going to switch over and pick a couple of questions that have been shared in the Q&A chat from our audience members, and then perhaps then we can pivot real quick after a couple of those to some closing reflection thoughts from our speakers. But let me just start with, let's see here. So some of the questions, there's been plenty of questions that have come in. Thank you so much for our audience for engaging and asking questions of our speakers. If I can start here, there's somebody who wants to know about country cases, which could be a model case for the discussion of Sharia law and gender equality, especially in the public sphere. And so when we're talking about family law informed by Sharia in Muslim majority contexts being applied differently in each region, that actually ties in with Musawah's work on positive development. So I wonder, Hishama, if I can throw that to you real quick, and if you can talk about how those positive developments and the idea that Sharia is not monolithic, how that can be leveraged by activists in order to push for change.
Thanks, Alex. And I think I'll be very, very brief when it comes to this, responding to this question. I first want to make sure that, not make sure, but I first want to really urge people to be mindful of the use of things like Sharia and Sharia law. Through Musawah's research, we know that there is no such thing as Sharia law. In fact, it's actually a myth. Or a misconception, right? There is Sharia, which is the overarching principles, that Muslims believe in, which includes principles, the right to dignity, the right to life, for example. And then there is the interpretations of this vast Sharia principles that human scholars, primarily male scholars, have then taken, and basically gone through a process of jurisprudence, which we call fiqh, right? It is based on this jurisprudence, which differ from one scholar to another, that many of our codified legislation is based out of. And therefore, while you see that there are many similarities in codified legislation, of Muslim family laws around the world, we also observe that there are some stark differences. And this is primarily with regard to which interpretations governments, or rather, the codifiers have taken into account, and also the current context of that particular country. Other things like colonial legacy laws, for example, and the impacts of Dutch and other laws on the country's legislation, and so the country's political history, all those factor into what that law or practice is at this current time. So there is no such thing as Sharia law. In fact, out of the 44 countries around the world that have some form of Muslim family law or practice, you'd be surprised to know that no two Muslim family laws are identical. So there's a vast diversity, but this also means that there's a richness to this jurisprudence that we can investigate and explore, right? And I want to share with you some quick examples of some positive legislation very quickly. Algeria, the Algerian code, the family code, recognizes women and men as equal partners entering into marriage. There are provisions in the Algerian family code that specifically looks at marriage as two spouses cohabiting in harmony, mutual respect, jointly contributing to the family, etc. The Moroccan family code, the Musawah, recognizes marriage as a partnership of equals. So in terms of entry into marriage, these two, Algeria and Morocco, serve as good positive examples. When it comes to child marriage, another quick set of examples from recent reforms. Maldives brought in some legislation in 2019 that raised the minimum age of marriage to 18 without exceptions. Indonesia raised the age for girls to 19. It was previously 16 in 2019. We also have Pakistan's Sindh province, that has some really good legislation on child marriage, and while having Muslim family laws as well. So there are many positive examples of legislation and reform, and part of Musawah's work in looking at the global picture is tracking these reforms. I urge you to please take a look at all the resources on our website. We have, information about Muslim family laws as they currently stand on these 12 issues, for over 33 countries, as well as we've pulled out the positive, reforms from these countries into a table as well. So all this, my colleague would have shared with you in the chat, but I urge you to take a look. Reforms is happening. And fortunately, what we're doing is also using those examples to try to push for reforms in other countries.
Thank you, Hishama. Yes, assign them homework. Do your reading. There's plenty of resources on the Musawah website, and in fact, on all of the websites of the speakers who are here today who can help answer some of these questions. If I can go now to Nurjihan, there's a question here about strategies to make change. When we're talking about modernizing Muslim laws and codifying laws, what do you suggest for women's rights activists to do to help make the ground ready for great change? Like, what would be helpful for your own situation in India if you're thinking about how to reconcile this religion and rights frameworks and perspectives, and then take that step towards ensuring gender equality in India?
Yeah, so for us, the work is actually done by the constitution of our country. The constitution allows religion-based family laws to exist. So we have the Hindu law, the Christian law, the Parsi law, and the Muslim family law. So that constitutional framework is a strength for us, and that gives us that actually gave us a very strong headway as we demanded codification. So it's like if everybody else is having a codified law, why not us? No? So that made it easier for us. Other than that, we focused on the victim, so to say. So all our public meetings, we did a lot of public meetings, we did a lot of public hearings, we did a lot of research and study, and a lot of data, as we spoke earlier. That data was really important, because for the very first time that Muslim women's voices were being gathered on such an important issue. In fact, the whole drafting of the law happened within the communities. We had about 300 to 400 consultations over a period of 8 years with absolutely ordinary Muslim women, whose lived realities, so to say, we wanted to capture, and we wanted to capture their opinion and their voices. And so that is another thing which helped us: public hearings, public meetings, getting the victims to come up on the stage and talk about her story. So there was a time when we would only focus on getting so-called experts and scholars to be on the panel, but we changed that very consciously around 2010. And thereafter, the panel only comprised of women who were suffering, who wanted change, and who were demanding change. So that really helped us. And in spite of all the pushback and not speak to this Islamophobic government, so while we were aware of what we were doing, we wanted to continue to engage with the government, because we are not engaging with a political party. We are engaging with the institution of the parliament. So parties keep coming and going. Alliances, political alliances may happen and they may go away. But parliament as an institution, parliament as an lawmaking body of the country, as the apex lawmaking body of the country, remains as an institution. And we are reaching out to this institution and not to a political party. Although we were aware that, yes, Muslim family law issue has always been politicized by different political parties, either for the benefit of Muslim women now or for the benefit of the larger Muslim community, and especially the religious clerics and the Muslim men. So while we were aware of all this, we continue to engage with the government, and that is what we are going to do as we go ahead. So I think that helped us.
Thank you. And if I could open this same question to Sherry, Nada, and Hala as well. What can be done to seed the ground, to make it ready for the great change that we're hoping to see? What has been done by folks in your contexts? Could we start with, who wants to go first? Sherry, do you want to go first?
I think I mean, if I take it from the other perspective, the conservative Muslim lobby is basically, I mean, what Hishama was talking about. So the argument they have is that laws cannot be changed because it's divine. So actually getting that awareness to the grassroots is very challenging. Because there is an extremely strong conservative movement in Malaysia. So that is part of, I think, one of the must-dos in Malaysia right now. We recently had an Fgm campaign, and that was quite interesting because we saw some differences in terms of, the type of questioning that maybe our generation, the older generation, older mothers would have, as opposed to the younger mothers who actually wanted to know where is it stated in the Quran, what is it for, does it have any benefit? I mean, they were asking these sort of questions that the other group of mothers were not. So I think that is part of the, the part of the what we need to do to start them questioning, looking at their own lives and how the laws are not meeting their needs. And that's been, I think, the main focus of our awareness campaign. We're always trying to challenge that deep-seated belief system by showing opposite or different interpretations. And in Malaysia,
That's
really,
great.
yeah, in Malaysia we don't only have to compare between countries, but even our different states have different, fatwas, different laws. So it's
So
an
it
issue.
becomes very difficult. Yeah. Thank you, Sherry. And Hala, if I can point to you, and then again, super short because we're running out of time here, but what about any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I think we need to definitely address the elephant in the room, and as we really need to start talking about family law as a national issue and as a development issue. And not as an isolated issue, and and really look at the impact that family law has on women's lives, and to what extent it obstructs our existence and our engagements at all levels of lives. So that will be very very critical, and I also think that it's about time, not to shy away from addressing what dictates family law, what dictates our existence, women who are living under Muslim laws, that constructs, that patriarchal constructs that generates all kind of laws that does not actually, they try to dehumanize women. It's something that we should be very open in addressing, and not to shy away from engaging with it, not to shy away from engaging with religion. And I think, as we are trying to use intersectional analysis to carry out our activism and address our issues, faith and religion and who we are and where we stand, it remains to be extremely relevant and important in our struggle. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Hala. How about you, Nada, as the last speaker as we close this out?
Yes, thank you so much. So I think we need to look at marriage as partnership, not as authority. This is our key start if we need to do something about family laws in general. And I agree with Hala, this is a national issue. This is a regional issue. We claim to have the same faith, yet we have totally different laws. So how come you're telling me that I am, as a Muslim woman, have a different right than my fellow Muslim man just because of my nationality and my sex? This is not right. Something is wrong about that. So we need to change this. Also, something this is on the state's role. The state is responsible for enhancing the lives of the citizens. Accordingly, we as women, we need to be dealt with as citizens, as fully citizens with full rights. Based on that fact, it's their own responsibility to find out how to interpret Sharia law, or the fiqh, as we like the proper term is fiqh, how to interpret that according to my reality now, the lived realities, what women are facing in everyday life. This is what they need to focus on. They need to get out of their books and look at the streets, what's happening, how people are facing laws in court. That is the main thing. And then I would love to close with Zaina Anwar's quote, the one I love the most. If you don't want us to deal with religion, take religion out of the public space.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers. We're kind of at the end of our time, so I'll just take a couple of minutes to wrap up. We're at the end of our webinar, but certainly not the end of this journey that we're all on to reform discrimination against women and girls. And again, one of the biggest challenges faced by women's rights activists in this realm who work on at the nexus of religion and rights today is the reluctance to engage at all with religion. And yet the activists that we've had today, Hala, Nada, Hishama, Sherry, Nurjahan, you've all shown that to not do so is a non-starter. We must reconcile religion and rights and continue to push back to ensure that equality and justice for women in the Muslim family and Muslim contexts is achieved within our lifetimes, please. And so the struggle for equality and justice is placed within both the frameworks of human rights and religion as part of a larger social justice movement, and its time has come. And for many of you who've been working on this for years, for decades, you haven't been waiting. You've been making inroads in this quest for a more equitable and just system of family laws and practices. And for too long, Muslim women who've wanted to reform discriminatory family laws and practices have been told this is God's laws, and therefore not open to negotiation and change. But as Hishama so rightfully pointed out at the beginning of the Q&A session, the idea of Sharia itself has to be interrogated because of the ways that it's been weaponized and misused against reform efforts and used to silence women's rights activists. And so as all of the activists here have shown, we need to keep opening spaces for women and activists to keep making those arguments for change, to make themselves heard, to create new constructive dialogues where religion is no longer seen as an obstacle to equality for women, but in fact a source for liberation. And as, again, to quote Musawah's executive director, Zaina Anwar, she said before that in countries where religion is used as a source of law, public policy, and practice, everyone has a right to intervene and shape how that religion is understood, how that religious knowledge is produced, and then codified into laws that govern the lives of all of us as citizens. And so it's really time, it's beyond time to embrace the trajectory of justice that's possible in Islam in order to see that effectuated in reality in our lives. So thank you for joining us today, and to our extraordinary speakers. Wow, what an inspiration you all are, and how lucky we are to live in a world where you fight for equality and justice on behalf of all of us and your communities. I'd also like to thank my colleagues on the back end keeping this webinar running, Zulaikha and Rasha, and everyone tuning in to this recording after this first run. Thank you for being here. The video recording will be available on the Intractable platform, I'm told, and on Musawah's Facebook Live and YouTube channels. So stay tuned, reach out to us if you're interested in learning more about joining Musawah's Campaign for Justice. It's really great. We're doing some great stuff here, as you can see from the sharings by our activists today. So again, thank you everyone for being here. To our wonderful, wonderful speakers, a big round of applause. And good night, good evening, good morning, wherever you're joining us from. I hope you and yours stay safe and well. And until we meet again, check out your homework. There's a lot of different chat links that were shared earlier, and do your reading. Happy CSW65 to everyone. Bye now.